Good evening, everyone. My name is Anton Solak, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this presentation of the Aedes Consulting Group project on dengue fever outbreak prediction. My colleagues and I are very excited to present the results of what has been a challenging and fun project. Let me begin by introducing the project team. Mike Kellner served as project and mobile app lead. Mike is the Director of Resource Strategy and Analytics for TELUS, which is a Canadian telecommunications company. He has over 15 years experience in strategy, consumer analytics, predictive modeling, and financial planning. I'm Anton Solak. I served as chief editor. I'm the former head of corporate risk modeling at Chubb in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I have 23 years of modeling experience quantifying financial risk, designing and building simulation-based models, and providing data-driven insights to senior management. Jeff Goulet served as our R modeling and EDA lead. He's an advanced marketing analyst for Burton Snowboards based in Burlington, Vermont. Prior to that, he has a combined 10 years of experience working in various analytical positions in the fields of higher education and corporate pensions. Next, Prasanna Rao served as our Python modeling lead. Prasanna is a senior data scientist working at Zafin. He has worked primarily on Swift wire fraud, check fraud, and ATM fraud modeling using Python, R, SAS, and has built machine learning models from scratch to production implementation for major North American banks. Finally, Hema Gidam served as our dashboard development lead. Hema is a senior consultant at DXC Technology, a multinational IT services and digital transformative solutions company. In her current assignment, she's working as a BI lead on a multi-year BI program for one of DXC's clients, who's a large provider of employer-sponsored childcare. She has over 12 years experience in BI, data migration, and data warehousing. Moving on to the agenda, our project was inspired by the driven data contest Deng AI, predicting disease spread. In the project, Aedes Consulting has been engaged by the government of Puerto Rico to develop models to predict outbreaks for dengue fever, which is a significant problem in the territory. I'll start by presenting an overview of the problem, the goals of the project, and the overall approach that we took to meet those. Next, Jeff will talk about the data that was used to build our models, including the process of exploring that data and the outcomes of that exploration. He'll also discuss our time series models. Prasanna will then walk through the rest of the model building process, discussing each of the 3 remaining classes of models built and how they fared. Mike will summarize the conclusions we reached and the recommendations we would make to the government of Puerto Rico based on this study, including areas for future work. Then, and this is a segment of the presentation we're all very excited about, Mike will do a live demo of the online mobile app that we developed to provide the basis for a public alert system, as well as a means for managing vaccine inventory. Finally, Hema will walk through the dashboard designed to provide a broader audience with an opportunity to explore the underlying data, as well as the modeled forecasts. So moving to the overview of the problem. Dengue is a mosquito-borne viral infection that thrives in tropical and subtropical areas of the globe, exposing a total of approximately 1/3 of the world's population across 100 different countries. Infection by the virus causes an illness called dengue fever, which results in severe flu-like symptoms, fever, headache, etc., but is usually not fatal. However, it can also cause a potentially lethal complication called severe dengue. The incidence of dengue has increased 30-fold over the last 50 years. Globally today, between 50 and 100 million infections are estimated to occur annually, resulting in an average of 22,000 mortalities and a total economic cost of $9 billion a year. While a vaccine has been developed, one significant issue is that individuals with no prior dengue exposure can develop severe dengue from the vaccine dose itself. As a result, the vaccine must be deployed with great care. In Puerto Rico, for its part, the territory has experienced periodic dengue activity as far back as 1963, though the severity of these outbreaks continues to increase today. In an outbreak year, 25,000 people or more may be infected territory-wide, with as many as 6,500 cases in San Juan alone. In the 70s and 80s, the government looked to control dengue via the use of pesticides and household inspections. But with these approaches proving largely ineffective, authorities have turned toward a different strategy, mobilizing citizens to help control breeding sites, personal protection through insect repellents, and public education of dengue symptoms and care. Aedes Consulting has been asked to produce predictive models to help support this strategy. Our project has two main deliverables. The first is a short-term predictive model with a forecast window of 2 weeks. The aim is to develop a public early warning system that provides a red, amber, green style alert levels, where the alert level will be based directly on the forecasted severity of an upcoming outbreak. With as little as a 2-week lag between larvae developing and symptoms presenting in infected human beings, this system should allow the public to take preventative measures, such as to check the area for standing water and ensure that repellent is applied appropriately. The second deliverable is an intermediate-term predictive model with a forecast horizon of 8 weeks. Advance notice of the timing and the severity of an outbreak can allow for a vaccination strategy that balances the potential benefits against the risks to certain segments of the population. It can provide enough time to evaluate the current vaccine inventory, order additional doses if needed, and deploy them to areas of need. It will facilitate more efficient management of the vaccine inventory, for example, reducing the probability that purchased doses expire before being needed. And at the same time, it'll help minimize costs by ordering only as much vaccine as required. The remainder of this presentation parallels the 4 stages of our modeling process, as you see here. We first spend time exploring the data to understand exactly what we have, how we're likely to use it, and how we might supplement or amend it. Once we gain that understanding, we prepare the data for analysis, addressing missing data, outlying values, and engineering additional features that may have predictive value. Next comes the modeling phase. As you'll see, we wanted to cast a wide net and try a variety of different techniques in order to maximize the probability of a successful outcome. Final deployment comes in the form of a dashboard and an online mobile application, in addition to a presentation of recommendations in a formal report. In total, we projected a 10-week duration for this project from start to finish, and that ended up being spot on. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff, who'll talk about the data on which our analysis was based.
Thank you for the intro, Anton. So as Anton mentioned, we got our data from the Driven Data dengue competition, which originally sourced their data from a number of government sources, the Center of Disease Control NOAA, and the Naval Medical Resource Center. So we were given for this 938 weekly observations between 1990 and 2008. So that was a 19-year span. As a response variable, we are given the number of dengue cases in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And along with that, we were given 20 meteorological predictors that fell into the 4 main groups you see here: vegetation, humidity, various temperature metrics, and a number of precipitation measures. Next slide, please. So diving into this, we did some EDA to kind of get some basic data work to understand what we were working with in these predictor variables. First step, because we only had 938 weekly observations, which isn't a lot for building models, we wanted to make sure that each of them was usable. Some of the modeling approaches we took would eliminate missing records, so we wanted to make sure that all the data, all the observations were usable. So to do that, first we identified missing variables. Generally, they were under 1% of observations. Two of the metrics, the NDVI, the Northeast segment, had, I think, roughly 20% of the variables were missing. So to look at this, we'll get into that on the next slide. The second step was to examine the distributions for each. So we did that by looking at histograms and box plots to kind of see if there were any outlying values and to just get a better sense of what we were looking with there. Followed that up by looking at possible transformations. Given the models that we were building, it was a strong indicator that we wanted to use some lag variables that would give us the kind of lead time for each of the different purposes of those models. And finally, we wanted to consider the correlations both within the groups. Those 4 groups I mentioned before had a lot of high correlations within the groups and between the response variable and the 20 predictors that we had. So as I started mentioning earlier, to impute the missing values, we used the mice package in R, which allowed us to use a random forest approach to fill those missing values based on some of the other predictors in the set. This just gave kind of a more well-rounded approach than just, like taking the prior week's value or something more simplistic like that. And for the seasonal patterns, we ended up building the 2 different models with the different lag terms, and we settled on 2 weeks for the shorter term model, 8 weeks for the longer. And looking at the correlations within the predictor set, we found that the temperature variables were the 8 temperature variables were highly correlated. So we ended up moving all but one of those. Actually, some of the fields were exactly the same throughout. So that kind of, for the less sophisticated models, so the time series models that weren't machine learning, that was important to remove those to avoid multicollinearity. Outliers we didn't have a huge problem with. Most of the, with the exception of precipitation, most of the predictor values were pretty evenly or normally distributed and didn't have to dealing with the outlying values too much. Again, that's mostly for the time series models. The machine learning models actually handle outlying values pretty well. For feature engineering, we wanted to kind of cut down the number of predictors we had. The NDVI vegetation measures all had very low correlations with the actual dengue cases. So it seemed kind of redundant to include all 4. So we ended up creating a new variable that was just a straight average of those 4 variables. And for our modeling approach, we wanted to kind of do a wide range of models, like Anton had mentioned before, 1 each for the long-term and the short-term model. We wanted to do a couple, well, I guess only one really classic time series model, which was the ARIMA. It's the first one there, which we performed in R, and that's just a quick background. That's an autoregressive integrated moving average model. So that takes historical cases and the corresponding error terms, so that's the ARIM and the MA, and combines them to forecast future values. The autoregressive part uses lag cases to build a regression model to predict the future cases, and the moving average portion uses weighted prior error terms and combines that with the autoregressive terms. And this model was good because it allowed us to fit the external regressors, in this case the predictor variables. It fits the error terms from the ARIMA model to those, so it creates a regression model of that to bring in extra data to try and explain any patterns in the error terms there. And we did that with R. The second time series approach there was the neural net autoregressive model, which isn't necessarily a classic time series model technique, but it builds a forward feed neural net that uses the prior observations as inputs, and this was also a good one to use because it allowed us, again, to use external regressors that just were additional inputs. So that allowed us to use all the meteorological metrics there, whereas we wouldn't be able to use those in some of the other really classic time series approaches. Again, we did that in R, and then we did some more advanced machine learning models, such as random forests, gradient boosted trees, and the long short-term memory deep learning model, which was actually run by Prasanna in Python. And given the amount of data that we had, we wanted to split into a training set and a validation set. And generally, you shoot for more of a 70%, 30% respectively split to build models with, but in time series, it has to be chronological. So we wanted to capture as much of like the time series progression as we could as the cases of dengue, the pattern change as time progresses. So we wanted to capture as much of that as we could. So we actually split the first 17 years into the training set and the last 2 into the validation set. So it's more of a 90-10 split, kind of than the traditional, but it helps, I think, improve the accuracy of a lot of our models. And for an accuracy measure, we used mean absolute error, which is the absolute value of the predicted minus, actual minus predicted for each model. So the first model we used kind of as a baseline was the least sophisticated. You can see the top is the short-term model. The predicted cases are very flat throughout. They don't really capture any of the spikes. You can see in actual cases, there's a big spike up. You'll see this throughout in kind of the fall of 2007. So we ended up getting a mean absolute error of 19 cases per week for that, which is not a great, and you can see that a lot of that, it's used, so it's more accurate when there are lower number of cases, and it really doesn't capture the peak. The long-term model, which had the 8-week lag, also stayed pretty flat throughout. You can see it has a little bit more of a pattern to it. Again, doesn't capture really any of the spikes and is pretty flat. It ended up having a slightly better mean absolute error at 17, but still is clearly not a great fit. But the model provided a pretty good baseline for us to build off of. So our second model is the neural net autoregressive model. You can see from this, it looks a little bit better. It captures more of the pattern, kind of seasonally. It's smooth, but it does capture some of the pattern. You can see it follows a little bit of the fall 2007 spike. Definitely does not capture the magnitude. And the short-term model for this had mean absolute error of 17. The long-term model, a little bit better from a mean absolute error perspective, 14%. But again, it's the same. It was a little bit more accurate earlier when there were fewer cases. Just again, did not capture that spike in fall 2007.
Thanks, Jeff. This is Prasanna here. I'll be going over the machine learning and deep learning models. Apart from time series models, we also, like Jeff said, attempted machine learning and deep learning models like LSTM. Under machine learning models, we implemented a bagging ensemble like GBM. Random forest and GBM were both implemented in native R. The random forest model hyperparameters gave a mean absolute error of 8.6 for short-term model and 16.5 for the long-term. As evident from the graph of it, the short-term model did a pretty decent job, while the long-term model underpredicted during the peak seasons. Let's go to the next model, gradient boosting. The GBM model tuning the hyperparameters gave a mean absolute error of 7.5 for short term and 17.5 for the long term. As evident from the graphs, short term model did again a decent job, except it underpredicted during the peak seasons. However, if you look at a long-term model, it overpredicted during and underpredicted during the peak seasons. So compared, when you look at the machine learning models, random forest model gave a better, whereas the gradient boosting gave a better result for short term. Now let's go over to the deep learning model, LSTM. Machine learning models do not carry temporal information. That is to say, it just carries, it just depends on the information we get from the current input. Whereas recurrent neural nets or LSTMs, they can perform better as it not only has the current information, it also has the long-term memory and the short-term memory. So the long-term memory, short-term memory, and the current information, all the three together, they perform a better job compared to machine learning models. In our case, LSTM was implemented using TensorFlow in Python. And we used Adam Optimizer for optimization purposes. LSTM model gave a mean absolute error of 15 for short-term model and an error of 28.5 for the long-term. As evident from the graphs, the LSTM model overpredicted during peak season with short and long-term models, whereas the predictions were pretty good for the lean periods. One of the LSTM models is it depends on, it is driven by the data, and we did not have much data for training. Depend a lot on data. I would like to hand over now to Mike. He will be some recommendations.
Thanks, Prasanna. So I'll take us through the conclusions and recommendations section here. First on the conclusion. So as Anton mentioned at the beginning, the goal of the project was twofold. First goal was to provide a short-term or create a short-term predictive model that can be used to leverage in an early warning system for the Puerto Rican government. And what we found was that all of the short-term models that we did create beat our baseline or naive model, which had a mean absolute error of roughly 22. In particular, we had two models that did quite well. The first of which was the gradient boosted decision tree model with a mean absolute error of 7.57. Followed closely behind was the random forest model, which had a mean absolute error of 8.6. On average, what we found is these two models in particular only missed by about 8 cases on average per week, which is quite good and adequate for an early warning system that really just ultimately needs to provide a little bit of an alert to the public when things are starting to escalate a little bit, which we feel both of these models would be sufficient in providing. So either or would work for the public warning system. The second goal was to create a long-term model that allowed for strategic responses, including mobilizing resources, ordering vaccines, what have you, to mitigate the impacts of a spike in dengue fever in the region of Puerto Rico. Here, the results were a little bit more mixed. In fact, the neural network model that was created in R was actually the best one with a mean absolute error of 14. This was an interesting result considering it was unable to predict the significant spike that we saw in dengue cases in 2007. Followed closely behind again was the random forest model with a mean absolute error of 16.5. This model was quite good in that it was able to not only predict the 2007 spike, but it did relatively well in following the trend throughout the test or the training and validation period. So while it had a little bit of a lower MAE compared to the neural network on the trend, the only challenge with the random forest model was that it predicted a more aggressive increase in cases than we actually saw in the training or validation set, and it also was a little bit more aggressive on the decline in the cases that we were seeing throughout the training and the validation period. Overall, however, it followed the trend nicely. Regardless, just given the results for both of these and the larger absolute errors, we don't feel they're adequate at this point to provide a good measure and predictive capabilities to mobilize resources to order vaccines in case of epidemics. So more work is required in this area prior to moving ahead with either of these models. In terms of recommendations and next steps, there's a few that we have outlined here. All of them really revolve around just getting more data. As Prasanna pointed out, with machine learning and or deep learning models, more data allows for stronger and better results in the model. So the first of the recommendations is just capture it from a longer time period. So dengue fever has been increasing, as Anton mentioned, for quite a few years. So going back on a little bit more historical data and getting some cases, weather results, and so forth could allow for better trained models and better prediction. The next alternative would be just to go deeper on what we have available from San Juan. So looking at each of the areas within San Juan as little micro regions and getting more specific with vegetation, precipitation in that area, so on and so forth. Just getting more data in that regard that we could leverage to train and validate the models. Another alternative, which would be a little bit easier to do, I think, would be just to expand the analysis to include a larger scope and a larger number of locations. As Anton alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, this isn't isolated to Puerto Rico. It's in fact prevalent in quite a few different countries across the world. So there is a sufficient amount of data that we feel would provide good value and increase the predictive capabilities of the models that we do have. And then finally, just incorporating information on other factors. So a couple come to mind. So population being one. Obviously, if there's more people in a certain area, location is a little bit denser. There's more people to bite, and from a mosquito's perspective. So incorporating things like that, or people moving to different locations as well within this city. What is the migration of people relative to all of the other factors? And another addition would be construction. So our area is growing faster than others, thereby driving population in certain areas. So a few different and additional factors that we should be able to incorporate to create a more robust predictive model. So that's what we had for you from a conclusions and recommendations perspective. What I'll take you through now is just a view of our mobile application. And what we did is we leveraged our model to create the two scenarios. So the first of which was the public warning system, and the second of which was the strategic planning tool. And in this case in particular, we were leveraging it to provide a view on vaccines relative to the number of cases. So the first page here is really just a view of the historical dengue cases. And we have this broken out. So I have some capabilities built in here where one is we have the San Juan city here. And this is the historical data set that we do have available from the actual total cases. The way we built this as well was just to have the capability to expand the scope. So I mentioned adding additional cities and locations to the analysis would prove beneficial from a predictive perspective. We also incorporated that capability within the mobile app here. So the city right here as well as part of Puerto Rico. This data is fictitious, however. It's leveraged just to show that we do have the capabilities to expand beyond the single city. So a couple additional views to call out here. First, this is a complete view of the data by week. We can also slice it by year. So just like switching it to the yearly view here, we'll have the 52 weeks across the year broken out by 2001 through to 2008. We have 8 years of history in this view here. And you can see that it has been changing pretty dramatically over the course of the many years that we do have data available. Through each of these plots here, we also have the ability to include the alert threshold. Right now, anything under green is good. Obviously, we also have the Anton was alluding to earlier, where yellow is, well, we're trending in the wrong direction. And then obviously red, we want to take some serious action and do some things to help the people in Puerto Rico. So this is just a historical view here. We have two other tabs on top here. The first is the alert system, and this is the short-term view here. So a couple of things to point out. One of which is we do have the city options again for scale. We do have the alert thresholds to click to show where we're trending to relative to those thresholds. So on the left graph here is just our infections to date. This is just a trend of year-to-date results for the most recent year. In this case, it's 2008. And then the graph on the right just shows the prediction that we have for the 2 weeks. And in this instance, in San Juan here, you'll see that we're trending well below the thresholds, which makes sense if we go back to the historicals to look. January through to May is usually a lower point in terms of the number of cases, and it's in the May through to November timeframe we see the spike. Looking at the other city here, we also have another view here. Again, going back to the scale capabilities of the tool. Finally, the vaccine control, similar view to that of the alert system. We have our predictions year to date, or sorry, our actuals year to date, and then the predictions 8 weeks out for both of the cities. And again, this is a slightly different view in that it's looking at making some strategic decisions. And in this instance, we've included a vaccine volume, which just shows the trend and where we're expecting our vaccine volume to be relative to the predicted cases. So we can make a decision on possibly when to order additional vaccine to ensure we have enough given the number of cases coming up. So that's the mobile app. I'll pass it back to Hema here, who will take us through the mobile or the executive dashboard.
Okay, thanks, Mike. The common question that gets asked in business is why? So why dashboard? The answer is simple. As Albert Einstein said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. The main objective of any dashboard is to show visual representation of data that will help facilitate understanding and give ability to monitor the conditions. Data visualization is not only important to presenting our insights, but also for exploring the data for insights. Before I get into the details of the dashboard we have built, I'll briefly go over the design principles. First comes the selection of data visualization tool to build these dashboards. Second, identify and gather the data sources required to build these dashboards. Finally, how we approach to build visualizations. What is the story or insights that we are trying to project, understanding the structure of data, converting to BI data. So as part of this project, we have built an innovative dashboard which provides quick insights into the historical infected cases, data available for Puerto Rico, as well as the results of the various forecasting modeling techniques we have undertaken. We have used Tableau as the visualization tool for its ease of use, functionality, and ability to integrate with R and distribute easily on public platforms such as Tableau Public. We have leveraged the source data as described in the data section of the presentation, as well as the predictive modeling results developed as part of this project. We have built the visualizations to project the feature-wise variation of the infected cases, timeline variance of infected cases, model performance metrics, and comparison of predicted versus actual cases for each of the modeling techniques applied. Now let's go into the actual dashboard we have built. I'll give a quick demo. It can be accessed via this URL through the. As you can see here, we will land onto the home page, and this sets the context of the dashboard and what it has. As we can see here, this dashboard has 3 main tabs. The first dashboard is about infected cases analysis. Second is about infected cases drill down analysis. Third dashboard is about the modeling results. Let's go deep dive into each of these tabs now. Firstly, dengue infected cases analysis. This tab provides insight into the infected cases year-over-year variance, week-wise count of the infected cases, and the feature-wise variation of the infected cases. The spikes in the time series plots are obvious outbreaks. It can be observed that dengue outbreaks cycle and exhibit severe outbreaks every 3 to 5 years. Also, it can be noticed here that from the year 2000 to 2008, there is a difference in the infected cases every alternate year. On an average, a greater number of infected cases can be noticed during the second half of the year. Bottom chart provides ability to filter for a feature category and a specific feature within each category. To understand the variation of the infected cases with the feature values in points where the highest and the lowest cases occurred. This chart enables us to visualize any of the 4 primary meteorological feature categories we are evaluating: humidity, vegetation index, temperature, precipitation. All of these insights can also be derived for a specific year or a specific week based on the selection on these 2 charts. As we can see here, the highest number of cases are observed at a maximum temperature of 32.8 and a minimum temperature of 24.4 degrees Celsius. This way, we are easily able to identify which meteorological indicators could be signaling weather patterns that could accelerate the growth of mosquito populations. Knowing when and where to focus prophylactic measures is vital in fighting the spread of dengue fever and containing its impact on the population. Moving on to the second tab, this tab provides insight into the month-wise count of the infected cases and the month-over-month variance of the infected cases. Temperature being the most important feature among the available meteorological data for forecasting the dengue cases, we can observe the top 10 combinations of the maximum and the minimum station temperatures where the highest number of infected cases occurred from this chart here. It can be observed that the total infection cases are generally higher in the months of August through December compared to the other months. Also here we can see that the month of October has the highest number of infected cases at around 6,106. From this chart, we can notice that the number of infected cases has a 100% rise in the month of July as compared to June. Here we can see that the highest number of cases are observed at a maximum and a minimum temperature combination of 32.2 and 24.4 degrees Celsius. Moving on to the third tab, this tab provides a summary of the projected results over the 2-year test window. As explained earlier, we have built 2 model types, short-term and long-term, with different forecasting horizons to forecast the frequency of reported cases of dengue fever in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And we explored 5 distinct types of models in our analysis. The top left and the rightmost chart provide information on the mean absolute error KPI, comparison for the 5 modeling techniques applied for short-term and long-term model types respectively. This middle chart here provides a quick insight into the average MAE for the 3 model types, short-term, long-term, and baseline. And this bottom chart provides ability to filter based on a modeling technique, as well as the model type, to visualize the actual versus predicted cases for the period April 2006 through April 2008. The baseline ARIMA model, as seen here, produced a MAE of roughly 22, which is the number that we tried to improve upon. As we can see here, all our short-term models beat the baseline as measured by the MAE, with the gradient boosted decision tree model and the random forest model providing the most accurate results. If we see the actual versus the predicted plots here for the gradient boosted decision tree and the random forest model, it can be noticed that though the errors tend to increase during the peak annual seasons, both models correctly track overall increases and subsequent decreases in dengue activity. Further, we feel that the boost in accuracy provided by these models outweighs the lack of transparency that accompanies them. Simpler models such as ARIMA have a form that is more interpretable. For that reason, the user must consider the trade-off between the accuracy and interpretability. In this case, we believe that the gains in accuracy provided by the two complex models are worth the price of lower transparency. Now, on the other hand, the results from long-term model are mixed. As expected, given the longer lead time, the case count estimates are less accurate than those provided by the short-term models. Each of the 5 models that we explored has some strengths and weaknesses, and a simple metric like mean absolute error may not be telling the full story. With MAE of 17, ARIMA model produced average results compared with the other 5 candidate models. Neural network model provided the most accurate results. However, it did not forecast the moderate spike in the 2007 case counts. Gradient boosted decision tree model did a good job of predicting the spike in 2007. The LSTM memory neural network model had the highest overall MAE, making it the least accurate by this measure. If we can see here, it actually did a fair job of anticipating the case counts, mild case counts of 2006, but expected far higher numbers of weekly cases in 2007 than that actually materialized. The random forest model had a MAE that was slightly higher than the neural network. As we can see here, its timing is off, but its predictions were more accurate than its MAE might imply. Given the mixed success of these models, we would caution against taking any definitive action on the basis of these long-term results. So this summarizes the insights gained from the dashboard, and it can easily be scalable when we expand the analysis to include more locations or factors or modeling techniques. Hopefully this analysis and the results can be leveraged to mitigate the dengue spread, associated costs, and taken up for any further research. This concludes the presentation. I would like to end this with an inspirational quote from Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it's done. Thank you for watching.